Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising as we complete a 5-day program on Compassion 2.0, where we've looked at the imperative for compassion and a lot of the research that has been done about compassion. We convene this program against the backdrop of the horrendous events last weekend on October 7th, as Hamas launched an incursion into Israel that killed and wounded over 1,000 people. And now we're bearing witness to the Israeli retaliation against that event and the ordering today of 1.1 million Palestinians to begin the evacuation immediately of northern Gaza. And we're about ready to see a carnage and humanitarian catastrophe and ethnic cleansing of almost unimaginable proportions. The aspect of what's going on that I want to touch on today, because it is so important for us all to understand, is the fact that, as I've said over the last couple of days, we're now being caught up in a narrative that has identified the enemy, Hamas, a narrative that is now in the process of justifying total war to deal with Hamas, as Benjamin Netanyahu has said, once and for all. And what we're seeing around Europe and around the United States and Canada is a systematic process of eliminating dissent. Pro-Palestinian and pro-Hamas websites are being shut down. We're being told that any misinformation is going to be eliminated as the war machine now of Israel, backed up by the United States, which is moving 2 aircraft carriers into the Eastern Mediterranean, and is actually, as we speak, transporting the 101st Airborne Division, which has been in Europe in proximity to what's going on in Ukraine, to Jordan. And Secretary of State Blinken, who is now in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, will be going to Amman for further consultations. And what is very important for us all to take in is that we are now being caught up in North America and in Europe into a single narrative that is justifying a humanitarian catastrophe and war. And it is the manipulation of the media, particularly the social media and the mainstream media, around a single narrative and the elimination of anything else that is of acute concern for the democratic process in our world. And I want to use a single example from my alma mater, Harvard, that exemplifies the danger in relationship to democracy and free speech as we enter into what is now about ready to happen, because it distills in a single microcosm what we as members and citizens of democratic nations need to hold clearly in focus as we move into the next phase of historical unfolding in the Middle East. Shortly after the events of last Saturday and the Hamas attack, there was a group of Palestinian organizations and other organizations, 20 or 30 groups came together and issued a statement that while they deplored what happened with Hamas, it was important to understand that it was 75 years of Israeli occupation that had given rise to the frustrations and hatred that were now being focused against Israel by Hamas. Viewpoint that is shared by most of the rest of the world. And what happened was that immediately national organizations began to put pressure on Harvard to eliminate those organizations and the students that had made a statement in the spirit of free speech about their perception about what's going on. And several days ago, there was a big van that paraded through Harvard Square and around Cambridge, Massachusetts, carrying the names of the students and demanding that their organizations be shut down and the students be dealt with by the Harvard administration. Finally, yesterday, Claudine Gay, the president of Harvard, took a stand. And she said that she deplored what those students said. She condemned what Hamas had done to Israel. But she said courageously that Harvard was not going to take action against those groups that had expressed their point of view in a country that constitutionally stands for free speech, and thereby exemplified the essence of what I believe democracy should stand for, even when it's under duress. And you may recall the great line of Voltaire during the French Revolution, when he said, "I disagree absolutely with what you're saying, and I will defend to the death your right to say it." And I think what we're going to now witness is whether, in the face of what's going to now happen in the Middle East, whether we're going to maintain our commitment to democracy or whether we're going to succumb like we did during COVID, where any dissent was eliminated as misinformation, like we're doing with the Ukraine war, where any dissent is eliminated from the mainstream media. Are we, as citizens of democracies, going to tolerate, once again, the elimination of dissent once the powers that be make a decision that this is what's now going to happen? And so as an American citizen, as a citizen of a democratic republic, I think that we all need to pay very close attention, not only to the events in the Middle East, but also to the preservation of our democracy at this extraordinary time when the control of our media is not in the hands of the many, but in the hands of the few. And the technology companies that control the communication on the internet are increasingly in collusion with the political and the military establishment, and thereby choreographing the kind of communication that we're allowed to engage in. So something to reflect on as we are at such an extraordinary moment in the political events of the Middle East. And as we've been saying each day, when you look at the world events, compassion, tolerance, understanding, democratic principles are an urgent imperatives for our time. So it's within that context, I want to thank you all for joining Humanity Rising. And I turn the session now over to Tom Eddington, who will commence our program. Thank you, everyone, and welcome.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you for your comments every day this week as we've explored the conversation and the topic of compassion from multiple dimensions, the multiple facets of compassion. And we've attempted to distinguish between sympathy and empathy and tolerance and compassion. And the piece we haven't fully explored and really excited to explore today is self-compassion. It's the most important piece from my perspective. If we each can have self-compassion, it makes all other things possible. And I'm really anxious to hear from our panelists today as we explore self-compassion. So welcome, Carson. For those of you who haven't had a chance to join us this week, Carson Kelly is founder of Compassion 2.0 and has been a great collaborator this week in putting together an extraordinary panel for each of the days. And it's been my delight in working with Carson to put this week's program together. So good morning, Carson, welcome. And let's get things rolling here.
Oh, that sounds great. Thank you, Tom. And two, just want to add a couple of comments on that. For those two also joining, Compassion 2.0 is really about looking at the prosocial nature of our neurobiological being, in the sense that we are hardwired to be compassionate. So very excited to explore that. Today, as Tom mentioned, we will be exploring self-compassion. And to start with, we will be working with, or rather speaking with two, in my mind, brilliant people, looking at the section where the neuroscience of compassion comes together in their studies and their work. So I'd like to go ahead and bring on Nicco and Leo to join us. So if you guys would like to turn on your video and join. There we go. All right. Hey, guys, thank you for joining.
Thanks, Carson.
It's nice to have you.
Carson.
So I'd like to start, Nicco, with you. Curious if you just give the audience just a brief overview about the Institute. Doesn't need to be, super lengthy, but just to give people a touchstone as to where you guys are coming from.
Sure. Thanks, Carson. And thanks to everybody for having us and giving that fantastic and timely backdrop to this conversation. So yes, Leo and I are both from the Institute for Advanced Consciousness Studies. We're a 501c3 nonprofit research institute with headquarters in Santa Monica, California. And we basically pride ourselves at being at the interface of academic rigor with startup flexibility. So being able to do what I think is very cool, innovative research that, kind of bends some of the rules that would be in place in academia and allows for us to explore it in a rigorous scientific way. And, we publish in peer-reviewed publications and we take a very stern look at things, but from a very open-minded perspective.
Right. And what is the domain that you guys are interested, just generally speaking? I want to talk about E4.
Sure. Yeah, the domain that we're interested in generally is what I've been calling democratizing experiential states, specifically non-ordinary experiential states. And this is stemming from the idea that experiences can be transformative in their ability to update deeply entrenched beliefs, especially beliefs around empathy and compassion that change your behavior. And we're developing technology that permits for almost anyone to access these experiential states that can go on to make meaningful updates in their behavior, and without needing to take a drug, without needing to practice meditation for 10, 20 years, etc. That's the general theme.
Yeah, that's great. Awesome. And then I'll start again with you, Nicco, just very briefly, how did you come to this work?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, so I was working before with the Tiny Blue Dot Foundation, and we were funding different consciousness projects, more basic consciousness research. And together with the main funder there, we basically kind of flipped it to be thinking around, okay, how can we leverage neuroscience to create experiences to then bring these insights out of, the more hidden findings that tend to just only appear in research papers, and only maybe read by a handful of people, and actually bring that into a platform that can affect many such people. And that's been a passion of mine for a long time. I've been involved in personalized products, personalized software for a long time to help address the fact that there's neurodiversity, and bring experiences and technology to people in a non-one-size-fits-all fashion. And then that kind of naturally led to building this institute and doing the types of research that would support the deployment of such experiences.
Very cool. Leo, same question to you. How did you wind up working with Nicco?
Well, actually, Nicco and I have been working together for almost 10 years now. We sort of began as colleagues, and I think a friendship developed through that, which is a good mix for developing a good working relationship. But we began working together through the study of empathy. So I had this very interesting data set where we had people self-reported empathy, and then their brain data when they're just at rest, doing absolutely nothing. And I had this idea of, well, could we, even though they're not doing anything related to empathy, could we, just from the way their brain tends to operate, reflecting the way that they tend to be in life, right? Sort of if you look at how the passage of a river carves certain characteristic rivulets through the stone, could we observe through that people's empathic tendencies? And so I came to Nicco, who is this very, I knew already be very well versed in these multivariate data-based approaches. And together we published a paper in 2020, basically showing that we could robustly predict people's levels of empathy along 4 different dimensions just from looking at their brain doing nothing, right? And we're actually about to publish a replication of that in a whole new cohort. But that's how our work came together. And then we've a shared interest in human flourishing and the importance of transformative experiences to do that, because we've both been very lucky to benefit, aside from great mentors and training, from truly transformative experiences that have taught us, the things that really matter, which are compassion, kindness, love for other people. So, yeah, bit of a long answer, but that's it.
Oh, great answer. Wonderful. Yeah, God, there's just so many things to ask. So, okay, so along those lines of this little topic of empathy, I know that you're working on something called E4, or you guys call it E4. I know there's a longer name to it, and all of the E words I don't always get, and sometimes reorder them. But so, if you would, Leo, why don't you just tell us a little bit of start the conversation about your work on this? What is this project? How's it? How do you anticipate bringing it into the world, et cetera? Just let the audience know what you're up to.
Yes, so E4 is our very pithy name for a project entitled Emulating Entheogens to Enhance Empathy. And the idea there is that there is this important subclass of experiences, or non-ordinary experiences, that we call self-transcendent experiences, right? And we've all experienced at some point. It's during the major life transitions, like the birth of a child, the passage of a loved one, or during deep religious or mystical experiences, during advanced meditative states for those that have been lucky or disciplined enough to achieve them, or through intense psychedelic trips. And what is a self-transcendent state? It's a state in which you dissolve or transcend the boundaries of ego. You feel a tremendous connectedness to oneself and to the world and others. And you feel a sense of moral elevation, a motivation to live in a more noble, more virtuous, more compassionate way. And we've all experienced something like this. It's at the root of a lot of the sort of religious and mystical impulse, right? The problem is that it's such an important experience for mitigating the end of life fears and motivating compassionate behavior towards others. The problem is that many of these traditional routes are either, hard to reliably elicit, right? Whether like you can't make an important life event happen, right? And you may be someone who just simply isn't a position to engage in deep forms of religious faith along the avenues that currently exist. And as much as psychedelics are in many ways, if not a panacea, then certainly a wonder, they're not for everyone. If we're really being hard and honest about it, there are serious contraindications to many of the main psychedelics. So what do you do for all the people who are, let's say, too square for psychedelics, but a little too, too modern for religion, et cetera, the spiritually yearning, what have you? What do all those people have to be left out of this, important human experience? And so our idea was, could we, based on our best understanding of how entheogens, like advanced meditative states, et cetera, and psychedelics work, could we reverse engineer those a bit and in a first principles way, create technologies that engender self-transcendent states, help people get there in a reliable way. And as we all know, once you've gotten there, it's easier to get back there on your own, right? If you can see from the top of the mountain, at least you know how to get back there. And that's something we'd like to do. We'd like to democratize those experiences for every kind of person. And we're currently in the phase of testing out all the different pieces that we think come together, like technologies to help dissolve the boundaries of self and other from a perceptual standpoint, things to bring together, to bring the body into narratives such as interoception and aesthetic chills, and a host of other components. And we're currently testing all those and looking at their effects on, real life ecological forms of prosocial behavior. And that's the long and the short of it. Yeah, that's all.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
That's just impressive. So, Nicco, any other kind of additions? Because there's so many things.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I'd love to add on that, one aspect that's important here is that, we're beginning to know a good bit about certain mystical experiential states or psychedelic states and how they go on to confer meaningful updates in belief change and promote ecologically valid prosocial behavior, right? So obviously that's a big net positive, but if we can understand a little bit more through neuroimaging about what the brain looks like in those states that then go on to confer these benefits, we're asking the question, is there a non-pharmacological route to induce the same type of state, or what would be like a neuromimetic state to that would then allow for, as Leo was mentioning, all of the socio-cultural, pharmacological contraindications that typically block people from reaching these types of experiences? Can we get them there through a number of different means, right? I sometimes draw parallels to a carefully crafted film, right? The ways in which it can actually curate your emotions, make you cry, make your heart swell, and really kind of motivate you to take a different course of action afterwards. So there's some inspiration there, but for us, one thing that we're highlighting that is kind of pertinent to some of the recent news is for something to actually change your mind about the way that you should behave in the future. If you want to become more compassionate or more empathic, you really need to feel it in your body, right? You can have the cognitive, pontification around things, but things really seem to stick when you feel it in your body, right? And there's a whole other branch associated with that with like somatic therapy, et cetera, of releasing past trauma, et cetera. But on the flip side of that, right? Like what's the opposite of PTSD, right? It's these very intense, insightful experiences, right? That then can go on to manifest in the body. So we're taking the body into consideration and leveraging insights from, practices such as Vipassana, body scan meditation, leveraging things that already interface with the body and cognition, things like Leo mentioned, aesthetic chills, like when you're so moved by something that you actually feel a propagation of bodily sensations in this very pleasurable fashion. So it's a very large moving, eventual experience that we want to create, but that's kind of the general idea.
Awesome. Just in a sense of it, I mean, again, there's a lot of topics to unpack here. How how would you envision, you wave a wand and you've done a bunch of research and everything's like been perfectly executed and so forth. And some person is coming in that Leo described, someone who's too square for psychedelics and or too modern for, say, traditional religious frames for them. They show up and they say, awesome, I'd like to experience any number of these things that you've just described. Let's talk about aesthetic chills, for instance. Is it aesthetic,
Yeah,
chills.
like aesthetics, like art.
So it's like when you see a puppy getting helped and you feel all warm and fuzzy inside. Is that what you mean by
That's a related feeling called kamamuta. This is more when you hear, a beautiful symphony. For me, when it's, when I hear the Moonlight Sonata, there are certain points when I just get this uncontrollable sense of chills and goosebumps up the spine, and just for a moment, I lose the sense of self. It's very joyful in a deep way.
Brilliant. Okay, so you've, again, getting back to our thought experiment, what would the person do? Like, are they putting on goggles? Are they going into a room that has an amazing sound system? I mean, like, what exactly, help me understand and I understand maybe you don't know this yet, which is totally fine, but do you have a sense of it? Like, what would that look like? And Leo and or Nicco, either of you.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I wish we could bring it into the lab right now, but in the lab we have this infinity cube that was created by Lumina. They're amazing. You can check them out. But we've been working with them on developing this technology where basically you enter this cube and it creates kind of almost immediately this sense of boundlessness and extension of self, because you're surrounded on all sides by reflective materials, so mirrors on the top, mylar all around the side. And so the full eventual E4 experiences would take place inside of this cube while you're outfitted in a full body haptic suit or somatic touching suit that can actually send stimulation to discrete loci on your body as a function of the program. You'll be outfitted with this interoceptive device that our colleague Felix Scholler has developed with his colleagues at MIT Media Lab. That can actually help assist with the delivery of chills. It would actually send cold up and down your spine. You'll be outfitted with bioperipherals that are measuring your respiratory rates, your heart rates, and then you'll also have an EEG on, such that we can read out the neural brainwaves. And the idea is that you'll also be receiving auditory input through a musical composition and a complementary visual experience that then all complements an empathogenic guided meditation from a hypnotherapist. And the idea is, as the hypnotherapist is guiding you through all of these different aspects, right? First grounding you in your body, right? So that you're feeling in your body. And as Leo was alluding to, extending your sense of self into the environment by relating the environmental audiovisual components as related to your breath. So similar to, like, if I start breathing in and out, the environment and the music is swelling with me, such that the extension of agency is pushed out into the environment, which is very mimic to psychedelic experiences. And then finally, it's guiding you through this empathogenic meditation and trying to monitor and personalize the content as a function of your neural brainwaves, as we're looking for indicators of when you're in these types of states, so that we can then deliver you the information that we think will stick much better. And then there's an integration period afterwards and some ritual beforehand, trying to kind of ground it in the current context of experiences. But that would be the general thing, right? And then the longer term plan is that we can record that experience from a neural perspective and combine it with some of our other work that would then allow for you to kind of take a little goodie bag to go home and keep revisiting the experience through a personalized neurofeedback. So it's like you get into this experiential state that's very moving and profound for you, but requires all these bells and whistles and this big, like, 7-foot cube you got to go into. It's not practical to kind of do that regularly. So to scale that, we've developed personalized neurofeedback technology where we can instantiate initially a state and then give you tools at home to reapproximate that state. So you can reintegrate the experience and kind of get back there and begin to practice and cultivate the sensations. So that's kind of the end goal of what it would look like. But right now we're kind of testing all the different pillars of that.
Right.
It sounds easy.
And well, and also, and just to be clear, in case this sounds, at all like too like Orwellian, it's not like we're giving the intervention is not going to be one of like, this is how things are, this is the thing. It's not, it's the idea is we walk someone through the procedures of a loving kindness meditation, which are typically you are self-guiding through a process of extending compassion to different expanding circles of being. So however you do that, however you direct that, you're the one directing the attention, you're the one guiding the experience based on these instructions. We're just kind of giving you a bit more of a lantern to help you go along the path, but you find yourself the way on your own terms. And you get to a state, we help you get there, basically.
That's fascinating, because that actually brings me to another question in relationship to this, is the notion of agency, right? So what I'm hearing you describe, of course, is this cube, and with all of the componentry that you unpacked for us, including somatic suits and in the brain stuff, everything. Mm-hmm. So it's almost like you're encapsulating the entire human physio frame, including the brain and everything involved. And there's stimulus, there's relationships and so forth to breath. And like you were speaking to earlier, Nicco, about the expansion and, contraction. But within all of that, right, what is the agency to what you were just speaking to, Leo, is coming from you, right? So you, the subject inside this matrix, if you will, this physical matrix, is still guiding and directing the pathway forward. It's just this matrix is highly engaging, for lack of a better term, because it's wrapping you in everything, basically. And then there's this kind of dynamic relationship then that you're enhancing, however that subjectivity is pushing forward through the experience. That's correct.
Well, because the content per se, we're not showing you a bunch of images on screen. The content is this narrative that helps you take a path, and it's augmented by musical prosodic content that helps emphasize the peaks and valleys of it that are, to make it, to basically stick, to give it more of a score that help guide and amplify emotions. But basically it's just you there with yourself and this sort of boundless expanse. There's space for your own thoughts, there's space for your own feelings. It's not Clockwork Orange,
So that was an example around the aesthetic chills. Talk to me a little bit now about, say, the applications for a more empathic frame. Is it the same matrix, same everything, but just kind of a different narrative, a different journey that one is going on, so to speak, but the same physicality, the same box, the same skull cap and everything with all the sensors?
Well, the aesthetic chill, sorry, I can also take that,
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, just as a quick aside, it's like the aesthetic chills are what we think are an important pillar of the overarching experience that would help actually propagate the felt sensation of the insights through it. And the actual insights would be coming by way of an empathogenic meditation, something similar along the lines of loving kindness, compassion meditation, or actually more specifically a Tonglen meditation, where you're actually visualizing an expanded self and the environments encouraging that. But there is this, entry point for personalization. But yeah, I just wanted to insert that the chills are, nothing's actually driving just for the chills in and of themselves. It's that the chills are supporting.
The chills are one of probably many sorts of frames that are a part of this larger experience of which, what have you.
Exactly. Yeah. Because and the reason for that comes again from a very first principles attempt to, make a forward test of our best idea of how these self-transcendent states are happening at the level of the brain, right? Through the eliciting of aesthetic chills, we're helping tie you more deeply to your bodily state, right? And through this correlation between the state of the environment and your internal physiological state via the Lumina cube, we're also sort of tricking your brain or tying your internal states to the external environment, thus tying you and confusing you or blurring you with the environment, right? So literally helping blur the borders of self. And that seems, by all evidence, by all accounts, to beget a more prosocial compassion frame of mind, right? Being reminded of the connectedness of all things and the oneness of all things and the sort of illusory nature of self. This, by every account in every instance, seems to promote naturally more prosocial, compassionate behavior, right? Especially if well integrated and not sort of abused, right? Yeah.
Brilliant.
Yeah, and just to quickly follow up on that, because I think it's so exciting, and Leo kind of re-brought this up to my attention of what Plato refers to as anamnesia, right? Which is this concept of unforgetting, right? Of and it's interesting because it parallels a lot of the mechanisms thought to support psychedelic states, right? Which is that so much of our visual input and our personal visual experience and just our experience in general is due to a suppression of the vast amount of sensory input that we're actually receiving so that we can focus on the things that are important. And it's very important for our survival, right? Or for our continued existence. But under psychedelics, there's a relaxation or more so an alteration as a function of dose. It's important to be specific about that. But there can be a relaxation of these learned suppressions. So it's almost like, if you draw the parallel, it's as if you're forgetting what you had learned, which was the learning was for your survival, but it's not necessarily representative of this underlying primitive fundamental truth that we all used to know and kind of get reminded of sometimes, which is that we truly are all one and together and united in our human consciousness at the very least.
Amazing. Tom, you're on mute.
Just to pick up on a couple of the things you guys are speaking to, but before I go there, and we've got a couple of comments in the chat. Folks were asking if you're familiar with Candace Pert, the author of Molecules of Emotion. And also there's a question around Richard Powers' latest novel, Bewilderment, based on some research at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Wondering if you could respond to those inquiries from the audience.
See, I'm not familiar personally. Yeah.
I'm not. No, I mean, I know a good bit. I see that Candace wrote about the endocannabinoid system, which is fascinating. I've done a lot of work in trying to research that. I haven't tied it too much to belief, updating and how emotions would be. So I would actually love to. I'm going to write that down and check out that. So I appreciate that reference.
Yeah, thank you.
But no, I don't know the other works either. Sorry, I wasn't keeping up with the chat.
Yeah, no worries. I'll continue to monitor it and bring the comments in. So
Okay.
a couple of questions for you. So as I understand the human condition, we come into this world hardwired for collaboration, for cooperation. Compassion is innately part of who we are as human beings, and
Absolutely.
then we're conditioned to unlearn, or worse than that, we're conditioned to believe that we are, a misappropriation of Darwin. It's the survival of the fittest, and that we can't help ourselves. Of course, we're competitive, but that's not our sole reason for being in the world. And so it sounds like the work that you're doing is helping people return to their original state.
Yeah, we'll be reminded.
That,
yeah, I think, yeah, exactly. Being reminded of this sort of prior from which we all depart before, when we're born, et cetera. It actually takes some time by every account to fully individuate, right? It's this necessary adaptive fiction to be separate. And when the funny thing is, though, right, we are wired indeed to sort of feel with others and share in others' experiences. What's interesting is there's this process as an individual of then maturation to learn that though I feel your pain, you are separate from me for intents and purposes. And to truly develop compassion, I have to learn how, as an individual, to act correctly upon this shared feeling that I have, right? I have to learn to behave sympathetically, which means taking into account your needs, not just mine, right? Understanding that this shared felt pain is maybe coming from you, because also often people can become paralyzed or burnt out or simply self-soothing in response to the pain of others, which means like, yes, I'm glad you're feeling it, but the point is to feel it for them, right? The pain is coming from them, help them, right? Not yourself. So it's all very complex, but yeah, at least it's good that I do believe there's growing evidence for the notion that, yeah, we're not inherently selfish. I think that's a thing that's to some extent learned. And there are ways to compete towards a shared goal. There are ways to compete compassionately, I believe.
Yeah, I mean, I've got a colleague who's an Olympic athlete and has shared with me that, if you watch any competition at the highest level, oftentimes you'll see it in sprinting or other events. These are athletes competing at the highest level with each other. And as soon as they cross the finish line, one of the first things they do is they give each other a hug.
Yeah.
And there's just an acknowledgement that I'm better because of you. And
right.
That we are, we're just innately hardwired that way as species.
Yeah.
The other area I wanted to explore a little bit, I was reading a book last year, and the author was talking about the human body is hit with about 4 billion pieces of data and information per second. And only 4,000 of those 4 billion reach the brain, the skull brain, and then a subset of those 4,000 reach the prefrontal cortex. And that's what we're responding to. So the body is innately responding every second to information, to data. And it sounds like the work that you're doing is helping the person override some of the conditioning that only 4,000 are selectively being processed in the brain to have a better sense of what's there and override some of the conditioning that they have created for experiencing reality. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that's a very productive framework. It's very similar to kind of what I was saying before, which is that most of neural development, right, is actually pruning, right? So it's actually it's actually the development of a filter on all of it's dizzying, right? We wouldn't be able to even, understand where our hand was in front of us, let alone, how to navigate towards food, avoid enemies, build shelter, etc., if we're constantly receiving this barrage of sensory information. So the whole developmental experience is really this pruning and this inhibition, right? And that's how you end up with, I don't know the numbers, but this results in 4,000. And the idea is, okay, can we maybe go back into that original state in a safe setting and maybe like recalibrate what we're letting in and what we're keeping out, right? Change our antenna, if you will, a bit, and tune it to a set of different frequencies that are more beneficial to us. And so often, right, that pruning process it's always adaptive, right? But it's adaptive to the current situation. And when your situation changes, then you can very well have a maladaptive schema of sorts, right? Where you're seeing the world through this unhealthy way that worked well for your previous situation and now doesn't. And getting back into the state where you can then rewire things, right? That's why it's thought of this relaxation or this updating or altering of belief states, where belief states are really the degree to which you're pruning and inhibiting this barrage of sensory information. So I think that's a really good framework. Yeah, thanks for bringing that up.
Yeah. So as you two are doing your research, how are you anticipating and avoiding some of the experiences that we've witnessed, people where they've experimented with plant medicine or other things and had bad experiences where their reality was shifted or altered in a way that they couldn't handle it? I'm curious just to know from a human perspective, how are you controlling for that? What I'm interested in hearing more about that.
Well, because of our adjacency both to psychedelic research and meditative research, etc. We have a large network of collaborators who all take part in helping us design these experiences and also sort of inform the training of the people who are going to be interacting with any subject or any participant who comes in. And so there's a lot of experience in understanding the fact that people are going to be having very profound experiences, and that this has to be treated not as a clinical experience, but as a ritual experience, right? So there has to be attendance to set and setting. We have to cultivate a sense of rapport and therapeutic alliance and trust with the participant, and let them and be frank about the fact that there may be parts of the experience that are difficult for them, so they're not caught unawares. And unlike a pharmacological experience, in this one they can just get up and walk out, right? They don't. There's a stop button immediately, right? And as soon as they do, or when they complete the experience, which is hopefully pleasant for them, there's a period that we encourage them to take is also of integration. We want them to pause, take a moment to themselves, maybe with some very calming ambient music, some Brian Eno, what have you, do some breath work, and think about what you just experienced before we come in there and have them answer questionnaires and do different tasks and stuff. So we are attendant to the fact that it's not just giving them a thing or showing them a few things on a screen, that this may be very profound for them. But hopefully, particularly in the direction that we're taking it, which is towards prosociality and compassion and empathy, hopefully that experience will at least awaken if it's difficult, awaken something that's useful for them, right?
Brilliant. Well, Tom, I wanted to just keep an eye on the time, thinking that maybe we ought to thank these guys. I did have one more question for them. What is the timeline when you think about the box to the bag of goodies, that some reasonable amount of time will go by, or the amount of time will go by as it is in order to get to that point, but when individuals can show up and start to participate in the benefits of your work?
Yeah, so right now, we're running a number of different studies, approaching this from different angles. But the eventual full experience we've outlined should be completed about 3.5 years from now. Because right now we've done so much work on making sure that we can get you a chill experience, which we think is, paramount to this whole experience. And then we've also, there's other experiences we have at the lab that have been remarkable as well. We're doing direct neuromodulation of specific brain areas non-invasively, but they have resulted in a handful of extremely mystical experiences that have promoted compassion in myself. And we're running large studies on that. So there's so many different pieces, but yeah, in about 3.5 years, we should have the full E4 experience, as we call it.
Very exciting. Very exciting. All right, Tom?
Yeah, there was just a question in the chat, and it's drifting into a bit of the philosophical, but the question is essentially how do you strike the balance between oneness and uniqueness?
Well, I think that's part of the fear that guides that some of the fear that people have or tentativeness with these sort of self-transcendent experiences is that they will lose themselves. And I think that's an understandable fear from the perspective of an individual. But I think that generally speaking, you'll find that simply by expanding or blurring, you don't cease to be, because the you is greater than that, basically. And you're still a unique perspective within the whole. So, and no one else has ever had your perspective or came in at the time that you did and seen all the parts of the one that you did. And you can be both individual and unique and whole. And the whole is endlessly complex. There's no you don't nothing to lose. There's literally nothing to lose.
I love that.
Anything that's there you'd like to add, Nicco?
No, and yeah, Leo kind of captured it. I think it's important to have a balance and, to retain identity for yourself and, to recognize that at the end of the day, it still is most beneficial in a even in a utilitarian sense to help yourself first, right? Put your mask on before helping others, right? And that's something I've personally struggled with a lot in the past is almost like losing ego too much and focusing on others and then realizing that actually doesn't really help anyone, which kind of circles back to this concept of self-empathy and self-compassion that we led with. So I think it's important to have reminders of both and maintain balance, right? It's just don't forget that we are still all one in you. So that prevents you from becoming too much of a megalomaniac, right? Or just like too ego focused. But it's important to have some ego in this particular human life consciousness experience.
Yeah, I often think of in contemplating that question in Buddhist teachings on emptiness. Who am I?
Right.
Is it my arm? Is it my name? Is it is it the person I was yesterday? Is it the person I'm going to be tomorrow? Who is the me?
Right. Yeah. It's always a good question to think on.
It's fantastic. And I come from like a memory background, and I always end up feeling like personal identity is so rooted in autobiographical memory. It's hard to disentangle the two. I've done a lot of writing and poetry on this stuff too. It's a fascinating concept. Infinite too. Infinite explorational space.
Yeah, I find that some of my best peak self-transcendent sort of moments are, oddly enough, even though there's a sense of boundlessness, I find that I feel simultaneously insignificantly small, which feels kind of nice actually, but also profoundly realizing the tremendous causal web that my actions are part of, and hence that I have tremendous responsibility and can affect a lot of things far beyond what I can see, but that I am myself very small and insignificant. It's a nice feeling. It's a good combination. As opposed to the opposite, right? Feeling like you're enormous but powerless and impotent.
I know you both have other commitments coming up at the top of the hour. So we'll invite Chris into the conversation, and you guys can stay with us as long as it works for you.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, guys. I'll try and tend to some of the chats.
So welcome, Chris.
Thanks, Tom. Wow, what a conversation that was. Fabulous. And I just so much respect to Nicco and Leo for living what you're talking about. Clearly, you've had experience in non-duality and that you're bringing this into the world for everyone. So much gratitude. Fabulous work.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, let's keep it going, Chris. Where would you like to start or continue the conversation?
Where would I like to continue? Well, I really appreciated when Leo was talking about how when we're in the world and we experience intense suffering, sometimes the system shuts down, we kind of burn out, and we are unable to basically keep any kind of compassion or prosociality going because we drop into a threat state. And so what self-compassion does is actually allows us to be with suffering, the pain of others and our own, in a way that we can maintain an awareness of our interconnectedness and also the quality of warmth. In other words, what Leo was saying is that when the boundaries get blurred, that compassion and prosociality naturally arises. And what happens in a threat state is that the boundaries get rigidified, and then we lose our compassion. And so how do we reconnect? How do we reconnect with our own experience? How do we reconnect with others? And that is, I think, the easiest way of reconnecting with ourselves when we're suffering, is with self-compassion. It's just like falling in love or falling asleep. We can fall into compassion for ourselves, warm up our own internal experience, and then include others in that circle of compassion that we have regenerated by relating to our own suffering in a new way. So I would say that would be a link, one of many links to what Nicco and Leo were talking about.
Well, terrific. Thank you for helping bridge the that piece of their work to the work you've been doing around self-compassion. And you know, when I look at the state of humanity, you know, we spoke to it briefly yesterday when we were talking about the Sustainable Development Goals, and a recognition that for humanity to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, the interdevelopment goals were necessary. And you know, doing this work, the world has become incredibly challenging. We've created a level of complexity. It falls far short of what Mother Nature has created, but we've created a level of complexity that demands compassion more than ever, and that's part of the reason why we're doing the program this week. And so, love to hear more from you about self-compassion, whether we're talking about the neuroscience or the practice or the acknowledgement that it's needed more than ever.
Yeah, I mean, you know, if I think of what we are missing in this world as we try to deal with global problems, complex problems, we're fundamentally missing the inner view. You know, we all have an outer view, but we don't actually know too much about what goes on inside of us. And I think we're also afraid of what goes on inside of us. So apropos the inner development goals, what does it take even to turn inward? You know, a lot of people are just afraid of turning inward. And I think the reason is because they don't have tools, you know. It's really quite astonishing that during the pandemic, when the whole world was in a kind of forced retreat setting, the number of people who reached out for to learn meditation, to learn self-compassion, you know, our Center for Mindful Self-Compassion just blossomed during the pandemic because everybody was looking like, what do I do with my mind? I can't go outward. I'm stuck inward. I can't stand this. What can I do? And so self-compassion, I think, is one of these resources or these skills that really allow us to be in our inner world in a happy way, you know, in a way that we can even like write poetry, as Nicco was talking about. You know, how do we inhabit the inner world safely and in a way that we can grow in an inner way that can actually then also embrace others and the problems that we have? I think basically being able to deal with pain is the answer, how to deal with our own inner pain. And throughout the history of humanity, compassion has been the main resource that human beings have dealt with suffering. The irony is that most of us nowadays think of compassion as mostly an other or an outer directed thing, and we have, you know, sorely ignored inner compassion. And that imbalance needs to be corrected, in my view, if we are going to ever, if humanity is ever going to expand our circle of compassion, we must include inner compassion. Otherwise, we just can't do it, for the reason that Leo was talking about.
Yeah, how do we help dispel that myth that if somebody's being self-compassionate, they're not being selfish? And you know, there's a quick leap that folks will make to, if I'm being self-compassionate, I'm just being selfish.
Yeah. So that I think you nailed it, Tom. That seems to be the one of the major obstacles to actually getting curious about self-compassion and then even practicing self-compassion is the myth that it's selfish. Another myth is that it's weak. Another myth is that it's self-indulgent, that it's like self-pity, that it's going to reduce our motivation to achieve. All these things are myths. But in answer to the question, how do we get around it? It's the research. The research is very clear that as people grow in self-compassion, they grow in compassion for others, And some of these other myths like weakness, there are 5,000 studies now on self-compassion in the academic literature, 3 or 4 coming out every single day. And in a nutshell, you could say the main finding is that self-compassion increases emotional resilience and coping. It helps us to deal with tragedy, it deals with hardship. So it's a powerful inner resource. And so the data is definitely on our side. But I do think, apropos what Jim was talking about, what's the narrative, I've taught self-compassion all over the world, and the global narrative is that you're not supposed to be kind or compassionate with yourself. You need to be kind and compassionate to others, and self-compassion is a bad thing, is a selfish thing. So we need to change the narrative slowly but surely through people understanding what this is. Maybe change the name, Tom. Maybe self-compassion is a bad name. Call it inner compassion.
Yeah.
So there's a branding problem. Out of curiosity, Chris, this is gonna I'm just gonna ask the question, even though it might sound a bit naive. Why is it that you think, or I should say, expand upon, why is self-compassion considered bad? Where does that come from?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. And, there's no definitive answer. But I think the answer is both physiological and cultural. Culturally, most of the world religions have really been focused on trying to bring harmony into the world. And so the effort has been to, encourage people to treat each other in a kind and compassionate way. And also how selfishness and ego gets in the way. So I think self-compassion has been conflated with selfishness and ego. And this is the case all over the world. I've taught in China, and it's basically they say, oh, well, we're not self-compassionate because we're Confucian. Others say we're not self-compassionate because we're Catholic. Others say we're not. So, so everybody's got a cultural reason, but it's pretty universal. So I think there's that narrative, but I also think that it's physiological, and that is that when we suffer, we usually experience a threat state, and the threat state is a fight, flight, freeze state. But when there's nothing we can fight, we turn it on ourselves, and fight becomes self-criticism, flight becomes shame and self-isolation, and freeze becomes rumination. So instinctively, we criticize ourselves, we isolate ourselves in shame, we get stuck in our heads in rumination when we suffer. But when other people are suffering, particularly people who we care about, we don't do that. We do the opposite. Instead of self-criticism, we're kind. Instead of self-isolation, we connect. We show a person a sense of common humanity. And instead of ruminating when somebody else is troubled, we try to open the frame. We sort of encourage kind of mindful, spacious awareness. So actually, these 3 qualities of kindness, common humanity, and mindfulness are the opposite of what we do in a threat state. So the physiology of self-compassion, which really corresponds to these 3 components I just mentioned in Kristen Neff's model, the physiology of self-compassion is a care state rather than a threat state. So the physiology of threat is often based on adrenaline and cortisol, hormones like that, whereas the care state, more endorphins and oxytocin. So in answer to the question, why doesn't it come more naturally? I think physiologically, we need to be able to shift our physiology from a threat state to a care state when we're suffering. And the way to do that is to bring kindness to ourselves in the midst of suffering.
So that was wonderful to hear. Just to expand further on that, then, how does one then choose to move from the threat state perception to the kindness towards self perception and shifting all of these physiological frames at the same time, and as a result, I guess, right? So I'm not being very clear. Let's say there's a moment where I spend my life and I go into this place of harm towards self, basically, as you described it in those three ways. What is the tipping point at which point I can no longer go into harm, but I choose to go into care for self? I don't know if I'm making sense, but how does that work? Is that a cognitive activity? Is it a permission? Like, what is your thought on that?
Yeah, that's another great question, Carson. Well, so the first thing that comes to mind is, in AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, they talk about the gift of desperation. In other words, the usual way we do things, sometimes they just don't work anymore, and we're desperate and we start looking for new ways of doing things. And if at that time, compassion is an option, self-compassion is an option, I think people will seize it. Personally, this was definitely my case. In other words, what my doorway to self-compassion was through 20 years of public speaking anxiety that I couldn't touch with all the skills that I knew as a clinical psychologist with a specialization in anxiety disorders. Nothing worked. And until I learned loving kindness meditation, especially for myself. Nicco was talking about loving kindness meditation, and 4 months of just loving myself as a broken person who could not, crack this nut of public speaking anxiety, changed everything. I got on stage at a conference at Harvard Medical School, and I was trembling when I got up on stage after 4 months of, self-focused loving kindness meditation or self-compassion meditation. And, I was trembling, but there was a new voice in the back of my head that said, "Oh, may you be safe, may you be peaceful." This is not the typical voice that was in my head when I got up to speak in front of an audience. And then immediately I looked at the audience and everyone looked beautiful to me. And when you're in a public speaking anxiety in a panic state, the audience is the enemy because they could judge you, So in my own personal experience, Carson, there was the gift of desperation, or what is called sometimes creative hopelessness. So I think that's what enables something new, but we actually need to offer something new to people when they're broken. And this is, one of those things. But just let me add one thing, and that is, because what you're asking is kind of a practice question, like, okay, so what is it that we could offer to ourselves? What can we start to do if we want to be self-compassionate? And the answer is really, really quite simple, because self-compassion is a U-turn. It's a U-turn. So if we ask ourselves, how do I treat a good friend when they suffer, when they fail, when they feel inadequate? How do I treat a good friend? And then the U-turn is seeing if we can treat ourselves in the same way. Can we talk to ourselves in the same tone? in the same language? Can we invite ourselves to do things that we might that we might be willing to do with a friend? So to do a U-turn. So we have the gift of desperation, and then what do? How would I treat a friend in this situation? And usually it's very different than the way we're treating ourselves.
Fascinating. I know from my own personal journey of my own challenges, oftentimes I'll find myself creating, I don't want to say harm in a sense of like going and punching somebody, but in the sense of just creating difficulty in some of the relationships that are around me, just because of my own family of origin stuff, my own, traumas, et cetera. And at the one hand, it's this paradox of saying this behavior is not desirable. I'm creating an environment that I experience that people are upset, or they're having a difficult response to my choices. But at the same time, what is the place that's choosing to do that, right? Why would anybody in their right mind choose to perpetuate harm? So for me, at least, I've come to a place of trying to hold the balance, of hold myself responsible and accountable on the one hand for the activity, but at another, being able to say, well, let's unpack why you've chosen in the past to do that, and understand and work through that as a separate issue. So that it isn't this constant perpetual, like, well, you're just a jerk, and that's just how, quote, ontologically are forever. Right? So it's, I don't know if that makes sense.
Well, what you're describing is, taking a moment of curiosity and responsibility, but Carson, it's also a moment of self-mercy and self-compassion when you're willing to look at the causes and conditions that lead you to behave in that way, So actually, by doing that, you are already being self-compassionate.
Right.
You're creating by creating that openness toward yourself, you're really creating new possibilities and openness with anybody that you might be tangling with, right? This is very much that experience of falling into compassion as we fall asleep or fall in love. We can fall in compassion toward ourselves by just looking with curiosity at why am I doing this?
And then I also find too, it's been helpful for my own practices of compassion towards others to be able to say they have the same permission to do for them. So if I'm experiencing harm from them, there's an opportunity for them, hopefully, that they might choose to understand what motivated them to be harmful towards me, how they received harm to begin with. My words aren't quite on target.
Well, the reason why words fail is because the thing is so recursive, and where does it begin? Does it begin? As Nicco and Leo were talking about, our sense of self expands, enormously into the world, and also historically into the past. Where does it all begin? Yeah. So ultimately, what we can start to do is take some responsibility for what we're doing here and now. But the only way we can do this is with warmth or with kindness and a quality of connection. It can't just be done intellectually. This is one of the main things we've learned from integrating self-compassion into mindfulness. It's not just about spacious awareness. It's about warmth and connection and spacious awareness. We can only see clearly when the heart is activated, when we are warm. This is very important to be able to recognize what's going on. We have to be able to recognize with an activated heart. We can't see clearly if the heart's not activated.
Sure, fascinating. Tom, do you have any thoughts?
I was just thinking about the work of Dr. Marty Glenn. I don't know if you're familiar with Marty's work, Chris, but she has done a lot of research on what she calls the window of presence. So how present am I from moment to moment, and how large is my window of presence, so that I'm less apt to go into either hyper or hypoarousal states, the flight, or freeze. And so there's a series of practices, polyvagal nurturing, some of other practitioners' work to help an individual expand their window of presence, so that they're more apt to be in a self-compassionate state, more apt to be present to the needs of the others around them. I don't know if you know of her work or similar work.
Well, I'm not aware of her work, but yeah, I mean, there's overlap between spacious awareness and relaxation of the nervous system and activation of the care system. You know, there's overlap between those aspects. One of the most consistent physiological findings with self-compassion is that it's related to heart rate variability, and heart rate variability is a measure of vagal tone, activation of the vagus nerve. So definitely there is commonality, but from a purely subjective point of view, self-compassion and compassion itself regulates emotions through care and connection, right? Whereas a lot of other approaches focus more on attention and awareness, like what am I paying attention to and how am I paying attention to it? Another way of saying it is that, for example, in mindfulness, the main question is, what am I experiencing moment to moment? Compassion asks the question, what do I need? What do I need? So this is a different set of questions, which are with a lot of overlap and complementarity, but they are somewhat unique questions. But at the end of the day, space creates warmth and warmth creates space. The question is, what do I need now? Do I need to bring some warmth into the picture? Or do I need a little more space, equanimity and wisdom, What do I need now? And what we are trying to do, Kristen Neff and I and the Center for Mindful Self-Compassion and 4,000 teachers around the world, is really encouraging people to ask this other question. Is what's called for here is warmth, care, and connection? Like, consider this a possibility. This is real. You can do this for yourself, and the research shows this is good for you.
Yeah, what I like about your reference to what do I need, it ties to the basis of some of the work around nonviolent communication. That
yes,
you're in connection with what you need, which are expressed through your emotions, then it results in a more healthy relationship with other through our communication.
Yeah. And so one of the nice things about self-compassion is once you know what you need, self-compassion actually is kind of a technology for giving yourself what you need. So often in life, we are reaching out to others for, love, belonging, connection, validation, respect, reaching out. And you know what? The world doesn't necessarily give us everything that we need. But the good news is that a lot of that we can give to ourselves. Definitely we have to be engaged in the world with others and in connection, but other people cannot meet all of our emotional needs. We can meet a lot of those emotional needs directly. So when we ask the question, what do I need? That doesn't mean that other people need to give it to us. It means we can also give it to ourselves. That's the gift of self-compassion. And actually, research shows that we're a lot easier to be with in relationship when we're not so needy, because we can actually meet some of those needs ourselves.
Indeed.
Well, Jim, I'd like to bring you back into the conversation, and go ahead, Leo. Sorry to cut you off.
Oh, I was agreeing. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. Me too, Leo. What a marvelous session. Boy, this has been
Well,
quite extraordinary. And you know what's been coming up for me with both your presentation earlier, Leo, with Nicco, and now with you, Chris, is the power of intent.
Hmm.
And I'd love to explore that with both of you, because, you know, I was just wondering, you know, in terms of everything that you're doing, Leo, with Nicco in your company and all these little widgets and systems and all the stuff that you're doing, you know, people can have good trips and they can have bad trips. And we know from the research of Stan Groff and Rick Tarnas, there is a powerful influence on the quality of one's psychedelic journey by their natal chart and what their horoscope is for the day.
Interesting.
If you don't know the research, that was a very important part of the early inquiry into what determines a good trip from a bad trip, and they couldn't figure it out. And someone suggested, this was in the 70s at Esalen Institute, someone suggested that they look at people's horoscope, and they found with, you know, well over 90% accuracy that the one's chart determines almost predictively the quality of the trip that one would take. And but that also raises this issue of intention and what, you know, what the larger planetary alignments are intending, but also one's personal intent. And I'm just wondering with both of you, starting with you, Leo, how you cultivate intention as part of the process that you're designing for.
Cultivate intention as part of the process that we're designing for. Could you be more? Could you elaborate a little bit on the question? Sort of.
Well, you know, I mean, when we think about compassion 2.0,
Okay.
you know, when we think about empathy, and then Chris, I think it's embedded in what you're doing, because you have to intend self-care. You've got to figure out that you need it, and then you've got to intend it as an intention towards some type of action. And I was just wondering, Leo, it may not have anything to do with what you're doing, but if the point of the exercise is not just random experience, but the cultivation of positive emotion, gratitude, empathy, and compassion, it would seem to me that that would be an aspect that needs to be cultivated in the system. So for an example, you know, when one takes ayahuasca, you know, one typically does it in a group with a guide, a sacred presencing of intent for the journey, because that's, if you don't know where you're going, you're liable to end up somewhere else, as they say. So I was just wondering whether you account for that in the work that you're doing, which is quite extraordinary, I must say.
Thank you. Well, there's a number of ways, right? If I'm understanding clearly, is the intersection between what are we doing in terms of these techniques to facilitate a self-transcendent experience, and obviously a big part of that, they're doing a form of guided meditation that's precisely intended and designed for that, but also obviously, without overly biasing them or setting them up for possible disappointment, because, you know, in their journey towards that state, you know, they have to be open to encountering many things. You know, we do inform people honestly in advance of the type of experience they're going to be having, and what is the sort of ostensible goal state of that experience, whatever it looks like for them. So we do try to, we want to instruct them with that, and also be prepared to, you know, answer any and all of their questions after the fact as to, was that what you expected? What was your experience like? Like we ask people, a big part of this is that afterwards we're going to be asking people a lot of questions about what was the nature of your experience? How do you feel now? How do you feel towards people? How do you feel towards yourself? And as I'm sure you all know, especially like, Chris and studies of mindfulness, that often just giving someone the space and the opportunity to think at length and appraise a feeling and an experience gives them much more of a sense of agency with regards to it and how to integrate it into future behavior. Something I wanted to say earlier is just that in the vis-a-vis the role of self-compassion as it relates to our behavior towards others, right? To counter this idea that it's weak or that it leads to selfish behavior, is that something I've found as a great benefit from the long-term mindfulness practice. At this point, I've meditated for almost 10 years, is that much as, teachers say, it's not that you stop feeling angry or envious or hurt or resentful or betrayed. All these things, you still feel them very intensely, but you also have just a bit of space and time to watch them come in and take a look at them, almost in a bemused, compassionate way yourself. Like, oh, what an interesting strain of anger that is. I wonder what that's about. That's, wow, look at you, and have that, and even run with it and walk with it, and embody, for example, a very negative feeling and take it to its logical course, all in your own kind of space before it ever gets then inflicted onto someone else. By the time you actually talk to another person or are out engaging in the world, you've walked through this whole ugly emotion. You've even thought about where it comes from and what does it actually want? What would actually be the outcome of this, maybe rightful indignation you have? All these, you get to play, you get a bit of distance. So I guess what would summarize what I'm saying with regards to your question and the past stuff is that intention can be best cultivated and best expressed by the cultivation of internal space and internal mindfulness and self-compassion. It allows you to better express your actual intention and better understand it, right? Yeah. Kind of a rambling answer, but I tried to cover everything.
Not to worry. Do you have any quick comment, Chris? And then I have a question for you.
Sure. I think intention is everything. I think intention is the most subtle part of human psychology. We have intention, we have emotion, we have thinking, we have behavior, but intention is the most subtle, and intention drives the train. That's the locomotive. And so I think intention is key. And also in self-compassion, we basically self-compassion training is goodwill training, not good feelings training. Goodwill training, but not good feelings training. But the inevitable byproduct of goodwill is good feelings. So when the train is pointed in the right direction, it will carry along our emotions, our thoughts, and our behaviors, and so forth. But what Leo was saying, I just want to kind of echo in a way, and to say that that progress in self-compassion is entirely dependent on the refinement of intention. And ultimately, it's about how much mindfulness is embedded in self-compassion. In particular, we have what we call a central paradox of self-compassion practice, and that is, when we suffer, we practice self-compassion not to feel better, but because we suffer. Not to feel better, but simply because we're suffering. In other words, self-compassion should not be considered like a slick new way of manipulating how we feel or manipulating or rejecting who we are? Can we be fully present with our experience right now, the way it is, and with myself right now, the way I am? Can I hold what is present in this moment in a radical embrace? This is intention. And everybody starts self-compassion with striving, which is I want to be a different person and I want to feel differently. And then they become disillusioned. They actually, everybody experiences desperation because I'm still the same person and I still feel bad at times. That's when we're broken. And that's in that brokenness. If we can embrace ourselves and hold ourselves in that brokenness, that's when self-compassion actually really happens. Everything before that was all an illusion. This isn't self-compassion. Self-compassion is being with what is, with radical acceptance. So all this comes down to exactly what you were saying, Jim, which is intention. The refinement of intention determines whether or not self-compassion works and whether or not self-compassion actually what it is. It is all about the intention to receive and hold ourselves in this present moment just as we are.
Yeah. Good. Thank you both. Very, very illuminating. I'd like to just touch on another, it's a vast area, but I think it's worth getting both of your perspectives, starting with you, Chris. And that is how these experiences are refracted through culture. I was very interested when you said you got 4,000 teachers all over the world. And when you ask about it, the Chinese person says, oh, no, I'm a Confucianist. You ask in Europe, oh, no, I'm Catholic. And all of that. And I'm just wondering how this process of self-compassion is experienced and refracted through different cultures. And I asked this, in relation, for example, between high context cultures and low context cultures. And, the United States is one of the lowest context cultures in the world. We're all running around like John Wayne, rugged individualists, and, nobody's going to stop me from whatever it is that I'm doing. And then there's high context cultures like China and much of Asia, where the community and the collective frames and identifies how the individual is and how they view the world. So I would just be interested in how both of you understand the impact of culture on this work of the cultivation of self-compassion. And Carson, I know you're deeply immersed in this. I would love to have your comment too, because context shapes content. We know that, right? So as the context shifts, our content is refracted in a particular way. So starting with you, Chris, what would be your comment? Then Leo.
Well, I like Nicco's comment that our development as human beings, neurological development, is about pruning or filtering, and culture does that. Culture prunes and filters, and it basically creates the screens through which we look at reality, and especially the way we look at ourselves. So that is to say, it is hugely important at the level of relativity, the nature of our childhood experience and our ongoing cultural experience. And so that's just a given in my view. But what's interesting, apropos self-compassion, is that the opposite of self-compassion is shame. So if the three components of self-compassion, according to Kristen Neff, are kindness, common humanity, and mindfulness, the opposite components, self-criticism, isolation, and rumination, are actually key components of shame. And if we look at how shame unfolds in other cultures, for example, more collectivist cultures like in China, we actually find that people experience more shame in China than in the US. However, it is more transitory. It doesn't linger so long. So somebody
Great point.
might get a shame attack because they didn't do well on a test because it reflects badly on my family. But since I am part of the family, and I will always be part of the family, and I will never be extruded from the family, the shame doesn't last so long.
Mm.
So maybe that's one way of approaching it. Love to hear what you have to say, Leo.
Well, actually, continuing from that, I think one major factor in like mental health and unhappiness and lack of meaning and alienation in our more individualistic culture, and ostensibly classless but clearly not, right, is something that people like Alain de Botton has referred to as status anxiety, right, where we're taught, and then I think there's a lot of systemic reasons for why this perspective has been encouraged. We're taught that basically we're capable of anything is possible. And the dark underside, of course, of that sort of ominously positive message is that whatever happens, if you fail in what you thought you wanted, and you fail in any of your ambitions, it's your fault and your fault alone. It's this moralizing of failure and this moralizing of hence of poverty and a moralizing of inequalities and things that are often, but not always either. It's not just the system's fault, but there are things that are that are about the world that one shouldn't always turn inward. So there's a lot of I think danger and also a lot of pain that is caused by people internally directing things that go wrong in their life, often as a result of large-scale forces far beyond them. And I think it's something you see particularly in parts of American culture where self-reliance has been encouraged almost to an nth degree, such that it becomes everything becomes these internalized feelings of like what you're saying, shame, which impedes self-compassion, which in turn impedes compassionate feelings towards others. So it can be a very pernicious thing, right? Where we determine that our agency lies, and striking a good balance between those. That was interesting. That notion that shame occurs more frequently but is more transitory. I remember one of the earliest works of Freud that I became really interested in was actually what's it called? Like the Guilt and Civilization. Just like me to forget the name, but one of his more philosophical works where he talks about the distinction between guilt and shame and how different cultures emphasize one more or the other. So that came to mind. That would be my comment there. If there's a central earlier question in the conversation that I'm now forgetting, feel free to refresh me on it.
No, you got it.
Right.
You do not feel any shame.
I try to do so very rarely.
Good. Carson, why don't you comment on this, because I know you've thought a lot about this, and then Tom, you can round us out.
I'm not sure how much I have to add. I'll just kind of share what's been up for me really through the course of this whole week and thinking about this. And I think as a philosophy student, I think it's the notion for me of the gaze, right? So this notion of shame is, who is the witness? What is the ascription of who's witnessing us as an object, right? This constant interplay of this subject-object dualism that's in place, right? So there's this notion of particularly in the frame of the Abrahamic religions that we are the object for a much larger subjectivity. And so as an object in which we view our own selves, we're constantly assigning, value against what we might perceive this larger, all-encompassing subjectivity in terms of how that would perceive our behavior and if it's kind of right or wrong, right? So then, I've been thinking about that, and the notion too of then when we flip the model and we are the infinite subject and we're looking into the subjective world, right? We were talking about this with David, and around the notion of the environmental issues, right? Namely, we're this vast subjectivity experiencing the subjective world from which we can consume and destroy and kind of leave this relationship, this out of balance condition, because it's an object for us as a subject. I'm not sure if I'm making any sort of sense, but for me, when it comes to this notion of compassion, particularly self-compassion, there's this oscillation, I think, of this polarity of this simple subject-object dualism. Further go off on it, I think what's happened most recently, right around the year 1900, when we moved from Newtonian physics into quantum mechanics, or we moved from Cartesian philosophy into, say, Nietzschean and Heideggerian philosophy, and or from nothing to the birth of psychiatry and psychotherapy and so forth, right, which didn't exist, we start to play with this notion of perspective, right? So there isn't this hyper notion anymore of this vast singular subjectivity of which we are its objects. There's now this context, there's this constant context, and the notion of who, what we are, and truth, and those kinds of things is relative to where the subject, if you will, is looking from. I don't know if this is making any sense, but it's a space I was asked. So this is what's up for me on this. So for me, I think about compassion is this interplay of allowing whatever element is the subjective perspective to choose to bring peace, if you will, or a favorable gaze to that object, be it self or other. I don't know.
Yeah.
That's
Well, no, I think you're making a seminal point, Carson, because you're bringing in the quality of perception, and where you're perceiving what from where determines your capacity to create intent.
Precisely.
So that perception precedes intent, if you think about it epistemologically. And so thank you for bringing that in. It gets, that brings into the great mystery of quantum mechanics, because it's the perception that determines whether you're seeing something as a wave or a particle, because it's both simultaneously. So it's the act of perception that literally your subjective perception creates the objective world.
Precisely.
And great point to bring in at this moment. Well done. Well done. So, Tom, any final comment, and then you can round us out.
Yeah, just a huge thank you to Carson and all of our guests, Chris, Leo, Nicco. Great having you with us today. Delighted that we finished the week focusing on self-compassion. I've been watching the chat. People have been very excited about the week. I oftentimes go back to some of my Buddhist teachings, and I think about, as humans, we are, one wing is compassion and the other is wisdom. And so much of what Humanity Rising has been focused on is the wisdom wing of humanity. And it's been great to bring the compassion wing to a bit more life and a little bit more focus this week. So delighted to have been able to be involved and to bring another terrific week to Humanity Rising.
Honored to be here. And Nicco sends his warm regards to everyone. He was sorry he had to leave early. He said, I quote him, he said he could have done this all day.
I think we all could.
I'm looking forward to Compassion 3.0.
Well, thank you so much, all of you. This has been a wonderful session. And Tom and Carson, you've done an absolutely superb job of bringing in some extraordinary minds each day that have illumined a very complex but urgently necessary domain for all of humanity at this moment of catastrophic destruction all around us that we need to imbibe as quickly as possible with the greatest intent and with the doors of perception wide open to human possibility. So thank you all so much. So that brings us to a close for our 5-day program, everyone. You're welcome to the after session chat. You'll see the link in the chat box. You also received it in your Zoom reminders, those of you who are daily participants of Humanity Rising, have a good weekend. We'll see you again on Monday, where we're going to dive once again more deeply into the humanitarian crisis that is happening right now between Israel and the Palestinians in Gaza. Thank you all. Bye for now.
Thank you.